our partner, the National Association of Home Builders, did a study a few years back, and they found that for every $1,000 increase in the price of a home, there are 631 households that are now priced out of the home at what that previous price was before the $1,000 increase went up.
That's a substantial amount when you think that that's like 20%, 25% of the house.
Regional home prices are up 34% since 2019, which outpaced inflation by 8%. So,
now, when you say normal, my next question was, do you see a lot of pent-up demand for the region for housing?
I think just based on the number of units that we are underbuilt in our region and in California, yeah, we do have a built-in pent-up demand for that. Building shelter it's a noble pursuit. It's something that everybody needs. And once you have yours, you really ethically cannot do something that would prevent somebody else from having the same thing where you're at.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Dirt's Dollars. Today, I'm joined by Tim Murphy, who's the CEO of the North State Building Industry Association, or BIA, as we like to call it here in the Sacramento region. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks, Chris. Good to be here.
Yeah, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's close to the holidays, and we're getting ready for a long break.
Yeah, no doubt. I hear you. Okay, so, Tim, we were just chatting over the last couple of weeks about some topics that we might be able to, go over, and how does that relate to the building industry? What's on everybody's minds right now? And you had pointed out, that it'd be really pertinent to have a discussion around housing costs and the region's development climate.
Exactly.
So you were mentioning that the BIA, of course, you guys do a lot of in-house research, and you've got some things that have been brewing, some results, that sort of thing. And that's kind of what I'd like to go over today.
Sure. Yeah, we conducted for the first time in 5 years a regional fee study. And in the study, we examined the full scope of development impact fees and infrastructure costs for typical low-density residential homes, which average about 2,400 square feet, and medium-density residential homes, which are about 1,700 square feet, in projects that are distributed around the region. And our study showed that a new home buyer pays an average of $109,000 per door for a low-density residential unit compared to 5 years ago, and that's a 25% increase in cost.
So what was it 5 years ago? That's roughly about 75,000?
That ballpark, yes.
Okay. So
yeah.
That's a substantial amount when you think that that's like 20%, 25% of the house.
It is. Typically we like to see fees be below 15% of the overall cost. And the interesting thing about this study is while the fees have gone up, so have housing prices. Regional home prices are up 34% since 2019, which outpaced inflation by 8%. So our study showed that fees for low-density residential are about 15% of a larger home's price and 17% of a smaller home's price, keeping in rough proportion to housing cost.
Okay, so maybe if you could go over kind of the highlights of the total fees that you're looking at, that people pay. And we kind of jumped right into the regulatory side of things, so maybe pulling back a little bit, what are the total fees that people typically pay in a house when they purchase it?
Sure. So let's first talk about what these fees are used for. So we broke it down into various categories. So the first is essential infrastructure, and that is services like water, sewer, drainage, flood protection, solid waste and dry utilities, as well as local roadways. Then there's what we classify as critical infrastructure. Those are regional roadways, transit, public facilities. There's law enforcement and public safety costs that are worked in, as well as agricultural and habitat mitigation if the area calls for it. And then there are the desirable amenities like parks and trails and libraries and other community amenities. Affordable housing is also a component of that, and that has been a lot of jurisdictions are looking to do more to offset affordable housing by having fees put in place. And then, of course, you've got schools in new communities, and then there's the overall permit processing overhead. So when you look to break those down, over those costs, for the necessary infrastructure, obviously that's going to carry the larger percentage of the fees. But as I said, in the region, it's $109,000 per door. Sacramento County actually came in at $109,000 per door, so they are right at the average. But we saw El Dorado County with a 30% increase. Their average fee load is $125,000. Yolo County had a 15% increase over the last 5 years. They're coming in at about $114,000. And Placer were the champs. They kept fees at 17% over the last 5 years, and they're the only jurisdiction below $100,000. Their fee load averages $95,000 per door.
Okay, that's interesting. So when you say fees, what does that exactly include? You've got your fees that you pay the city or county for impacts or whatever. You've got your soft costs going into your consultants. You've got your mitigation. So what exactly are we talking about when you say permit fees?
Well, as far as permit processing, or you?
Well, you said approximately 20% of the total house cost would be in that, right?
So putting in the infrastructure for water, for sewer, for your electrical, your dry utilities, that commands a significant portion. And then schools also does command a high percentage. I don't have those breakdowns, memorized, but that's roughly where the breakdowns are. And we are finding, there are communities where they want to have, really great parks, and trails have really jumped to the top of preferred amenities in new communities, having connectivity between neighborhoods. And so, which are fantastic, but they do cost money. Yeah. So when you look at all these amenities outside the house that you want in a community, that's what it amounts to.
I'm curious, as part of your study, have you also looked at the comparative set of amenities for a residential community in California versus, say, other parts of the country, another state? Quite frankly, the reason I'm asking is one thing it's always struck me about California is I moved out here from Michigan, and back there, you pretty much take a piece of farmland, you stick a road down the middle of it, you put some houses in, and you call it a day,
Right.
And what I love, and also sometimes not so much like about California, is that there's always this upscale sort of regulations or, guidelines that you have to follow for putting together a development that includes like open space and all these other amenities. So the question, in my mind is not what are you getting for the bang for the buck?
Well, I think that depends upon the person who chooses a community to move into. Jurisdictions want to be competitive in what they have offerings for the homes in their community. So, they want to have great parks with great amenities, trails, like I mentioned. In some cases, they're charging fees to build regional amenities like water parks or things like that, big community pools. That help to foster a sense of community. And all these things really create great places for people to live. However, they have to be paid for. And, while we understand that new development needs to pay its fair share, there are a number of jurisdictions that are putting in amenities where that share is being borne solely by new communities. And so, we have to be sure that we are, in our advocacy, is that we have to take a harder line on fee growth, because as we see right now, with the average price of a home in our region in excess of $750,000, we need to be sure, as costs are moving beyond what the market and our home buyers can bear, where can we start to control some of those excess charges? And looking at fees is important. Now, we recognize that impact fees are a very legitimate and necessary tool to fund infrastructure and the facilities that growing communities need. If these are amenities that the whole communities are using, then the jurisdiction has some responsibility to foot part of the bill itself.
Well, that does make a lot of sense. I was kind of wondering, as you were talking about the public debt financing side of putting together these proper projects, even with tax increment financing or some other sort of funding mechanism that could carry some of that load.
Right. Well, fees are one part of a much larger and costly picture when you're talking about the price for construction materials, labor, environmental mitigation, and again, affordable housing. A lot of jurisdictions are using new home purchases to help finance the construction of affordable dwellings for the less fortunate in their community. Those are all choices that jurisdictions. I should say, the choice about affordable housing is a choice that they have in their control. But when you're talking about the factors like material costs and labor costs, they don't have much control over those. But when you're looking at how do you maintain a lot of these facilities that come into the district or into the jurisdiction, those come with annual service taxes, which are added into the monthly payment for the homeowner. And we are finding in a number of cases, it's those additional monthly service tax costs which are pushing the monthly cost of home ownership beyond what most households can afford. And those fees also do impact the ability for bonding for infrastructure on those lots. So, as more costs and more fees are coming in on the front end, it also does impact how much financing the projects can bear for the overall project, the master plan developer. So all these things have to be taken into account when you're setting fees for housing in your jurisdiction.
Yeah. So, at the very top level, I mean, you're essentially talking about policy change. And so I think that aligns well with the CEQA reform bills that have been passed recently to kind of streamline the process, that it's not only the consulting costs, but it's also the carry costs that you're reducing and the potential litigation that comes after that. So how are you, or how have you been successful, or are you still working on discussing these matters with local jurisdictions, and what sort of response have you gotten back about maybe tailoring back some of these amenities or some of these the reasons for some of these fees?
Yeah. Well, let me set the stage a little bit. What you're referring to on some of the reforms that came, that's the California Building Industry Association, which is our statewide housing entity. We're part of the federation. CBIA is our state level advocate. They deal with the state legislature and regulatory policy that comes out of the state government. There's about 9 or 10 local home building associations, of which North State BIA is one of those across the state of California. Our area covers the greater Sacramento region, goes all the way north to the Oregon border, but our work primarily keeps us in the Sacramento region, where most of the building is going on. And then we have the National Association of Home Builders, which is our federal policy partner. So that's our federation. The CBIA this last budget cycle worked with the governor's administration, and a bill was passed, Assembly Bill 130, and that created the most sweeping reforms to the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, that we've seen in some time, where our advocacy at the local level intersects. Some of the things that happened with this was there was a 6-year freeze on code cycles. So, every 3 years there's a change with housing codes to look for more improvements. And those cycles start every 18 months. And so it adds a lot of cost and uncertainty to the home building process. And so we got a 6-year freeze, but the builders had to have their plans and projects submitted before the end of the year. what we've been doing quite a lot of over the last couple of months since the budget passed is it's getting that word out to local jurisdictions and local agencies, because they're still coming forward and saying that, oh, well, you have to have the improvements that are coming out of the next code cycle incorporated, which go into effect after the first of the year. And we are going around calling, okay, no, time out. If the projects are submitted, not yet approved by the jurisdiction, but submitted to the jurisdiction before the end of the year, then they're locked into that 2022 code cycle. So there's been a lot of confusion and a lot of clarification with local governments and agencies to be sure that they are accepting what our builder members are putting forward to get ahead of the deadline at the end of the year.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. It's pretty tough to submit an application and then have to submit changes because the codes change before it even gets approved. Essentially, you pretty much have to start over almost.
Yeah, and for a lot of them, if they don't get it in by the end of the year, they will have to make those changes, which is why, there's kind of we're in a real rush. And, just this week alone, we've had 3 different home builders reach out to us regarding what a local fire district is telling them that they have to have included before in their projects going forward. And they're saying you have to have the new codes that go into place January 1. And we're saying, no, if they're submitted, then they can still conform to the 2022 codes. And as long as there isn't any major changes that go forward, they're good for all projects going forward with the 2022 codes.
Okay. Well, that is a good synopsis of what's going on with CEQA right now. I was also kind of thinking, in terms of policy, schools, the amenities that are required for schools or parks, or trails. A lot of these things are very subjective, and they essentially come out of the local community. So I would expect that your local governments, they have more say over how those things would be implemented than a state CEQA law.
Right. And there are, some jurisdictions have design guidelines for parks, the list of facilities that they want to have. Other jurisdictions might address them on a park by park basis and work with the developer. Certainly development agreements come into play, and what a builder developer might agree to with those. But, one of the areas where we can help to control costs, it's with how high performing these parks or schools are. And when I say high performing, how many different bells and whistles and amenities are coming with that? When you're talking about, a park, you want to have really great areas for kids to run and play and to be outdoors. But in some cases, if you've got parks that are adjacent to communities that have regional parks or really large community parks, we can ask the question, does this small neighborhood park need to have more bells and whistles when you've got another amenity that's just one neighborhood over? So trying to get them to recognize that, even if we're saving $1,000 a door, that is very critical. Our partner, the National Association of Home Builders, did a study a few years back, and they found that for every $1,000 increase in the price of a home, there are 631 households that are now priced out of the home at what that previous price was before the $1,000 increase went up. So when we're talking about fees, even small increases, compared to the overall cost of the home, can price people out. And so we have to be in the mindset, how do we value engineer the homes to be more affordable, but how do the jurisdictions value engineer the fee structure so it's not adding to the overall burden? As we did our fee study, and again, we studied projects that were already underway or completed in order to look at those costs. And we found, as I said earlier, those fees were roughly between 15 to 17% in general on average. We had some fees in jurisdictions were over 20%. Some fees were below 15%. But it's that 15 to 20% where project feasibility really comes into play. where a large, a real estate investment trust or a large funder for a master plan development might say, well, with the fee structure this high, if we're only going to get, 8 to 9% of a return predicted on our investment, well, we might as well go put our money in the NASDAQ as opposed to take the risk of housing and not knowing what the market's going to be like a year or two from now. So, we need to be sure that we are engineering the fee levels to where they're remaining in a level of feasibility. So when there's investment looking to come to our community to build the much needed housing that we have to have, that they're choosing our region.
How have you seen this bleeding into housing studies that local governments are required to have in place for their particular communities? Because if they are not being realistic about, let's say that they just think that there's going to be a certain number of people that move into their area, and therefore they have to provide X number of houses, but if the cost of that new development is high, then those people may not move there at all, and then they just price themselves out. And then so it kind of remains the question, or begs the question, what's their intent of doing that in the first place? And I know that that's going to matter a lot depending on where people are. We're in the Sacramento region where there's more growth initiative versus like the cities around the Bay Area.
Right.
But what's your take on that?
Well, and I'll just note, we still are seeing a good amount of people coming from the Bay Area and relocating here because of the affordability. They can come in and pay cash for a new home. When you look at the regional housing needs assessment that the local council of government, SACOG, performs for our region, they expect, okay, this is what job growth is going to be over a certain period of time. So we need to have this amount of housing within a community. The jurisdictions kind of take that information, but I don't know if they really feel how actionable that is. And what we're seeing in some communities, especially those where where the average housing price is far beyond what people in their communities need for affordable housing, there's not enough affordable housing being built, and so there are cases where the state is coming in and they are forcing communities to accept programs, or they're going to be penalized. For jurisdictions, however, that are keeping up with housing, where they are building quite a bit, the overall, as I said, a lot of the overall price control with housing is a little bit out of their reach. So, we are building homes that roughly 1 out of every 7, families are able to afford. And so if there's, there hasn't been a decision made to where we are going to ration housing only to those who can afford high-priced homes with high-priced fees buried in. We need to be more realistic about the kind of product that's out there, the variety of what's being offered. We see that there are a number of our builder members who are looking at different types of housing sizes, where they are building on smaller lots, they're building smaller homes, they're engineering, more price controls with the overall planning to help reduce costs. But, it's very rare to be able to find a home for under $500,000 in our region. And, when you look at where California is nationally, the average price for the average size home is several $100,000 lower than the average price for a low tier home in California. So, a lot of states are starting to experience the scarcity that California has been has adopted over the last several decades. And the only solution to bring down the cost of housing and to create more opportunities for people for home ownership, it's to build more. And we need to build as much of every kind of product that we can.
Yeah. And that kind of wanted to learn a little bit about what you're hearing your BIA members saying about, say, the North State or the Sacramento area for affordability versus the rest of the state, and how that's bleeding into neighboring states. But also, I was just thinking that the recent CEQA reform bill, I recognize that it's trying to limit the CEQA review process for certain properties, but we're really kind of capped at that 20-acre, inside of a urban area, motif for a property that is exempt from CEQA. As soon as you move outside of that to a greenfield area, boom, you're right back into full CEQA review, and that is super challenging. So I'm curious, one, what your BIA members are kind of saying about the Sacramento region or California in general, and number two, how you see any sort of response from CBIA, for example, about maybe reform further for CEQA.
Well, our members are saying the same thing that I did when AB 30 was first passed. This is a step in the right direction, but we're still a long ways to go before we really have the level of CEQA reform that we need. Right now, CBIA is working with the California Chamber of Commerce, the Cal Chamber, on a ballot initiative that they want to bring forward in 2026 that will address a more intense CEQA structural reform. The specifics of that have not crossed my desk yet, although I understand from my colleagues at CBIA, if you're having trouble sleeping, you can just start reading the first part of the draft ballot initiative, and it would probably take the trick. But they are working on bringing about realistic reforms that we need to have in order to move housing forward. And it will be an uphill fight from a political standpoint. I'll get, try not to get too partisan here, but from a political point in California, as a Democrat majority state-controlled legislature, having that Democrat control, we are faced with people who run for office in Democratic districts. They can't be outflanked on the left. And one of the most cherished values or priorities that the left have, that Democrats have, it's on the environment. So anybody who wants to run for office has to run and be the most progressive environmentalist who's on the ballot. And we've seen what's happened in the last 20 years because of that, 20 years or more. There are environmental interests that are looking to add to endangered species insects. And moving that forward, there won't be a greenfield in the state that won't have some type of environmental impact. And this is being done to engineer the way that people live in the state of California going forward. Environmentalists want to see people in high-density urban developments. But, unfortunately, 70% of Californians want to live in a suburban or a rural environment. So dictating where people can and cannot live is definitely, un-American, infringes on the rights of people to determine what kind of home or community is best for their family. But this is what the BIA at both the state and local level and the national level, this is the type of stuff that we have to fight. And, why we are such an important part of a construction and builder company's, their quiver of arrows. We are the ones who go out and we do the advocacy so we can prevent bad policy from happening or water down bad policy to find a good compromise so our builders can build. So there's predictability in the process.
Yeah. Okay. So let's see, where do we go from here? I'm curious what you think about whether or not, the current situation is delaying the number of houses that are being built around the region. And, what sort of expectations are you thinking might that have over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah. When I came to BIA in 2024, it was like the last of the really good home sale years that we've seen. 2025, we were about almost 2,000 units less than we had in 2024. Last year, there were about 7,000 units sold. I think this year we're just over 5,000, if I recall. So definitely it was a slower year. We just had our housing forecast a couple of months ago, and the folks that we had, the economists and the regional experts, believe that 2026 will be similar to 2025. It'll be, that, but 27 and 28 we should start to see some improvements. There are some, development and building still goes forward. But there's not as much spec housing being built. It's more along the lines of okay, if you're ready to build, we have your deposit, we'll start the house, and in 2 to 3 months we're ready to hand the keys over. So we're seeing builders do that. They're trying to control their costs as best as they can. The tariffs that have come out of the Trump administration have not had as much of an effect on pricing with our builders here in the community. They've been able to have their vendors kind of hold the line, and of course we've seen, tariffs are on, tariffs are off, they're back on, they're back off, they're this amount, they're that amount. So we haven't seen too much as far as the impacts from that. One of the things that's been helpful, we've seen the cuts in the interest rate. That hasn't helped with mortgage rates, which are tied to the 10-year Treasury, but it certainly helps with the acquisition and financing costs that builders have when they're building projects. So that will translate into some lower costs because they don't have the higher percentages that they have to pay when they're doing their financing for that. So we're hopeful that 26 starts off well, and we just continue to build to where we're back into a normal market cycle.
Now, when you say normal, my next question was, what do you see a lot of pent-up demand for the region for housing?
Well, I think with just based on the number of units that we are underbuilt in our region and in California, yeah, we do have a built-in pent-up demand for that. And the way that you address that is by building products of any and all types across the board, whether you're talking about multifamilies, townhomes, single-family residential, because whenever somebody has the opportunity to move up into a new house, there's now a dwelling that's been vacated behind them. So that does help. There are people who say we should only build affordable housing, and our take is that we need to be building attainable housing. And the difference between that, affordable housing means that somebody who is making between 30 to 80% of the area median income, it's a housing product that they can afford, where attainable housing means it's housing of all sizes, all types that a reasonable person can afford at whatever price point is there. We push for attainable housing because we need every type of housing that there is. There's been some conversations lately with between the local home building associations and the CBIA on what can we do to get condos back into the mix, because it's a great way for people to get that first ownership product without having to pay a higher price. But the trial lawyers, coming in after 10 years with their class action suits before the warranties expire, have pretty much made condo development in California, impossible. We need to find a way to bring that back in to where developers can build good products that people can buy their first ownership dwelling, build some equity to be able to move up to that next thing without the threat of litigation hanging over their head after 10 years.
Yeah, absolutely. That's huge. Okay. And I was curious, the attainable housing concepts, do you find that it's easier to find a middle ground with bedroom communities around attainable housing rather than striking up conversations about affordable housing? Because I know that's usually not very well received.
Yeah, well, when people think affordable housing, they think about, Section 8, they think about tenements, like back in the 70s where, you just saw urban decay happening. And that's not the case. An example that I like to cite is I was a planning commissioner in the city of Elk Grove back in the early 2000s. during the glory days, 2004 to 2008, when building was just going crazy. There was a product that was being built that was touted as an affordable project, and it was next to a more affluent community. And when talking with the developer about who they were targeting for the residents of their community, they were talking about policemen, teachers, the people who work in your service industry, so the grocery store clerks and the restaurant waiters and people who lived in that community. And the folks from the affluent community came out and they said, well, we don't want those people working here or living here. And I think we had to clarify for them and say, when you say those people, you're not talking about creating a community that would be a detriment to where you live and drive down values. These are the people who would come in, and ideally within, a 10 to 15, 20-year period, they'll be at the point in their careers where they're able to buy in the community next door where these folks live. We need to build as much product as we can for as many different people across the region, because if the service industry has to commute in 30 miles, how do they develop a good quality of life? How do they have for their kids good schools for their kids to go to? It really is important that we provide choice in housing across the board for anybody who wants to own a home and start to build their own personal wealth.
The irony about the affordability thing is if you just drive an hour up to Tahoe, the wealthy communities around Roseville would be considered affordable.
That's very true. We're dealing with we have partners with the Tahoe Truckee Contractors Association, and we'll talk to them about the policy issues. But the communities, the people who work in Tahoe, and the casinos, the motels, the restaurants, there are apartments where you've got 8 to 12 people living because that's the only way that they can afford it. Yeah. And with the casinos, like they hot bunk like they're on a nuclear submarine. Somebody's shift is up, they go to work, somebody gets off their shift and they come home and they sleep in the same bed. It's crazy to think about that, but we have rationed housing to that point just because there's this attitude, well, I finally have my piece of paradise or home ownership, and I don't want anybody else to come because it's just going to create more congestion and, more crowding. Well, that's what people were saying about you before you moved in. We have to be fair about it.
Absolutely. So, kind of a takeaway message that you might want to leave with builders, particularly, BIA members, but other builders and contractors in the area that are looking to build new homes in the coming years. What sort of advice would you leave them about how to approach doing so?
Well, when it comes to fees and dealing with that, the BIA, we want to be the tip of the sword for you as you go out and build. And that's the benefit about being in a membership organization like the BIA. We're the ones, our members will relay issues or challenges that they're undergoing, and we'll go out on behalf of the industry to address those concerns. So you're not potentially damaging yourself politically by doing that. We want our members to be in communication with us to let us know where they're having challenges, and we'll be the ones to take on to help them move forward. As I said, we're the tip of the spear. We're a very reasonably priced tip of the spear as well. I'd like to quantify the ROI that our members get, and when you look at the average member pays for dues, we're less than we're an employee that you pay less than 50 cents an hour for what we do. So when you think about that ROI, just in that alone, that we're addressing the amount of fees, we're addressing the various policies or issues that come in that make building more difficult or less predictable as you're dealing with the jurisdiction. We're working with the elected officials to help them understand the necessity of housing and what we need in the community. We're fighting against the NIMBY efforts and the environmental efforts that are looking to slow down and stop housing. And for people in these communities, I think that they should they should recognize that what builders are doing is that they're providing one of the most essential physical needs that we as human beings have. It's food, shelter, and clothing. Building shelter it's a noble pursuit. It's something that everybody needs. And once you have yours, you really ethically cannot do something that would prevent somebody else from having the same thing where you're at.
Good end note. Well, great. Tim, it was great to talk to you today, and I appreciate you sharing your thoughts about the region and what's going on here. I think it's really interesting to watch the housing industry grow around Sacramento. I've been here since 2004, and it's greatly increased since then. So there's always challenges, but I have always fundamentally thought that California is a great place to live and has a lot of amenities here. And as you mentioned, there's still a lot of demand. So we need to keep thinking about solutions of keeping things affordable while still making a great place to live.
Right. In our region still has so much untapped potential and promise. I like to say that where we are in Sacramento is that we're the real California. There still is a good affordability compared to the rest of the state. We have a very high quality of life. We have amenities like the American River Parkway in our backyard. We've got Tahoe up the hill and Napa, to the west, that you can get to in a reasonable amount of time. We've got the best food in this country.
Pretty good.
Out of the street. Yeah. We are where you want to be.
That's a good slogan there. All right. Well, thanks a lot, Tim. And I hope you have a happy holiday and going into next week. And we'll be chatting soon, I'm sure.
Great. Merry Christmas to you, Chris, and have me back again sometime. I enjoyed this.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.